Hello, my name is Saumitra Jha, and I'm a associate professor of political economy at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Affairs. I'd like to welcome you today to the second installment of our ongoing virtual course on critical strategies for dealing with conflict, sponsored by the UK FCDO and the Center for Economic Policy Research. Today is like also the second installment of our series on ethnic diversity and nation building. So, if for those of you who haven't seen the previous installment, you can go on YouTube and see what we talked about last time, and there's a very grim video of me there too, mostly. But today I'm going to build on that and move forward a bit. Now, just to give you a very quick recap of what we have been talking about, the motivating question that many of us have, obviously, many of you in the room as well, is how do we make sense of these dramatic changes that have happened in development, and to what role are ethnic diversity and nation building involved in them? So, this is this is Max Roser's basically chart showing GDP per capita in 1950 versus GDP per capita in 2016. And as we talked about last time, there's striking differences at this side of the tail. So countries which started off poor, some of them became 30 times richer, like Taiwan. Others actually became poorer during this period, like Burundi and the Central African Republic. So even one key question then is, why is it that we get such great changes? The poor countries, some of them remain poor. And the theme of the last class was to understand the role of ethnic diversity in that. At the same time, it won't surprise you to know that many of the places that are in that category are also places which have suffered extensively from conflict, often mobilized along ethnic lines. I should say that I'm here with my friend and able research fellow Saumitra Jha, and she'll be able to man some of the and answer some of the questions in the chat, but mostly we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Unless there's something important that's clarificatory, Saumitra can address it in the chat or bring it to me if so please pose your questions. Saumitra will triage them appropriately, and then we'll have time at the end for more Q&A, if that's okay. So, where we were last, one thing that we talked about was that given the feedback between ethnic divisions, the lack of winning of growth and poverty, as well as through of the lack of investment in public goods on one hand, and that of ethnic conflict, you can imagine that there are a series of different mutual feedback loops which can lead to countries starting off poor and ethnically divided, failing to invest, suffering conflict, and thus remaining poor and ethnically divided. We talked about different potential ways this could work and kind of intermediate channels, for example, weak formal institutions, differences in preferences, the role of interethnic competition or the lack of complementarity between groups, and trying to understand the importance of mobilization and organization. The part of our last time's class was kind of to talk about the pillars of things that we thought were crucial for getting at this problem. And I talked about three in particular. Diagnosing why societies are ethnically divided is really important for understanding the potential for leveraging the society's own strengths economically and otherwise to address these problems. Figuring out ways to improve formal institutions and effective governance in order to address the kind of the weak institutions that can often emerge in these settings, as well as looking at the other side, the informal institutions and the role of positive contact. So, if you go on YouTube and you search for our course, you'll find the previous iteration. It was also in the link that I flashed very quickly earlier on, but it's easy to find. For those of you diligent folks who actually were last time, this is where we kind of reached. We talked about these three pillars, as I mentioned, the roots of ethnic division, how to strengthen governance, and networks and positive contact. Among these, we talked about, so what I want to talk about today actually, just staying focused, is how to apply these types of approaches using some and using the example of some research that we've done recently that tries to do some of this. So what I'm going to be talking today is kind of on the strengthening governance pillar. We're going to talk about what we call apex corruption and how this can be, often is tied to what I called ethnic cronyism in the last class. This, the situation where oftentimes minority groups seeking protection will often try to get protection from people at the very top of government. We're going to talk about how apex corruption at the very top, can then have these deleterious effects, unmeasurable effects on the decline of democratic values in a variety of settings. Then we're going to kind of take an interlude and say, well, how do we think about the roots of ethnic diversity in the setting we're going to study, which is Mexico? And are there opportunities like complementarities that can be leveraged? So we're going to go back to the first pillar and try to understand that better. And I'll kind of refresh some of the learnings from last class there as well. And then we're going to jump to the future. We back to the present and talk about some solutions. We're going to talk about leveraging financial innovations and a line of research that I've been doing that can help us think about that. Again, refreshing some of the learnings from last class, as well as talking about some of the nation building literature that's emerged on how you can try to create cross-cutting national identities. And we're going to measure our effects on that as well, right? So to kind of just to recap, we're going to try to address this apex corruption question. We're going to go back in time to understand what are the roots of ethnic division in the setting we're going to be studying, which is Mexico and parts of Latin America. Then we're going to think about two solutions that we tested to address the problem of apex corruption, right? So this is joint work with Lalo Rivera, who's a PhD student at MIT, and Enrique Serra, who is at the University of Notre Dame. So this is actually a very famous Stanford alum, Alejandro Toledo, who, as many of you know, is the former president of Peru. But he actually went through our PhD program in economics for a spell as well, and we're very proud of him because he was one of the first kind of a path-breaking president of Peru in many ways, both because of his identity, but also because of his sheer accomplishment of becoming president of such a country. However, unfortunately, he was in the news more recently for taking $35 million in bribes. And in fact, the news talks about how his victims were ordinary Peruvians and who trusted him. And this kind of made this conviction even more troubling in many ways. Now, one sad feature about Peru right now is actually they have a specific jail devoted to former presidents, and that jail is full. In fact, they've run out of space for their jail exclusively for former presidents, which kind of gives you a sense of the gravity of the situation that can emerge in these types of settings. And its frequency. And it's not just a Peruvian story or a Alejandro story. I mean, he's a fellow Stanford alum, so I feel like I can mention him. But these problems are happening of apex corruption are happening at the top of government in a variety of countries in this world. And I'm sure you have many on your mind as we speak as well. We also, I don't need to tell anyone in this seminar that we live in an age of democratic backsliding and populism. It's not, every time there's an election, I think many of us hold our breaths, concerned that someone is not going to accept the outcome of the election, and it won't go as smoothly as it has done in past years. While this democratic backsliding is occurring, I think it's important to note that there have been trends in the exposure of corruption, including scandals implicating people at the very top of government. And so this is, we scraped LexisNexis for media mentions of corruption in both English and Spanish, and you can see that the trends are going up. Now, in many ways, one might say, well, this sounds like a very, this could be a good thing, right? So, the more we expose corruption, arguably the better it is for democracy, and maybe it is the case that this can improve and strengthen people's beliefs in the system, that it is in fact exposing these types of behaviors. However, the fact that remains that in, not just Mexico or Latin America, but even also in the United States and elsewhere, there has been a decline, as I mentioned, in support for democracy, even as there's been an increase in the perceptions that corruption is widespread in the government. In fact, in the US, the numbers are basically comparable. Around 75% of Americans believe corruption is widespread in the government, which is comparable to what is the case in Mexico at this point in time as well. So in this, so the paper that I'm going to talk about today is really try to understand, are these patterns causal? Is apex corruption eroding democratic values? And if so, what can we begin to do about it? And can we leverage some of the ideas we talked about in the last class, some of nation building, of financial exposures to address these problems? Can we think about the kind of the broader context of the place to understand how we can kind of build on existing strengths as well? So I want to kind of make a distinction here because we're coining a term, apex corruption, which, and I want to make clear why I think this distinction is important from local corruption. So this is a screenshot. Yes, in the bottom left of the screen, you can see a screenshot of what one might call an average Tuesday in Delhi. The Central Bureau of Investigation in India nabbed 2 Delhi policemen for taking 10 lakhs, or that's like 1 million rupees in bribes. Now, I think it's safe to say that many folks who've lived in South Asia would see this and kind of hardly bat an eyelid. I mean, this happens quite a lot. And now, what I'm going to argue, however, is that corruption at the very top of government is quite different than the sort of quotidian, daily type of corruption, but one can deeply affect the other. So why is that? Well, apex politicians, those at the top of the government, are important, I think, in 3 particular ways. One is that they are most focal. So people pay attention to their heads of state and those at the top of government much more than others. And so by doing so, they can actually coordinate beliefs and trust both in the system and in themselves. And this is particularly important because corruption, as we often think about it, involves what's called strategic complementarities. In other words, I have more incentives to act in a corrupt manner, to cheat, if I believe others are also doing so. Now, you can see that leads to a coordination kind of game where there are multiple equilibria. And if you kind of look in the top right corner, it is in fact the case that corruption has different levels around the world, and different countries coordinate in different levels. Now, the second part is corruptions are, heads of state are more likely to be role models. They're more likely to shape internalized norms of what is acceptable behavior. So, if you believe that someone that many people respect at the head of government is acting in an internalized norm, in an acceptable way, when they cheat or when they are honest, I'm going to argue, this can also have ripple effects throughout society. And the third is that they are directly influential over the institutions of governments, including those responsible for elections. So what we do in this study is we use a randomized control trial coupled with cross-country event studies to show that apex corruption at the very top, affects all 3 components of the institutions of liberal democracy: beliefs, internalized norms, volunteering, support for electoral organizations, and ultimately actual voting. And we're going to contrast that with mere underperformance, as well as testing 2 solutions. One is based on the nation-building literature, how to build a common national identity in an environment which is ethnically diverse. And the other, like as we mentioned in the last class, and I will give you a brief refresher, on using common financial exposures to bring people together and across ethnic divisions and ethnic lines. So I'm not going to go through the literature too extensively, but corruption, of course, is a crucial problem in development. And its extent, sources, and policies have been studied quite extensively. What we talked about in the last class is corruption is endemic oftentimes, or perceived to be so, in environments where there's ethnic diversity because of this phenomenon which is sometimes called ethnic cronyism, that when you have vulnerable minority groups, particularly ones which are are affluent, oftentimes the way that these groups will seek to, or individuals within them will seek to protect themselves is to buy protection from the people who are at the top of government, because they're the ones who have the most power to protect them or to basically target them if the need be. So you see these patterns of ethnic cronyism develop, and there are numerous examples in history as well as in contemporary settings where these kind of feedback loops between ethnic diversity and corruption occur quite significantly and quite commonly. We also there's also literature focusing on mostly on local corruption at the local and regional level, where they found that if you see evidence of local corruption, in the municipality, this can lead to more cheating in student exams. It can lead to even more supermarket theft. However, the accountability, there's important literature on accountability, which actually finds that when you randomly audit people, and you give them their information campaigns on the results of these audits, this can have effects on incumbent re-election economic activity. But if you look kind of in a coordinated study, such as the Metaketa, there's been actually broadly no effect of these types of audits on voting or largely because it's believed that these audits have not really changed people's perceptions of corruption. People already thought that, the politicians were often fairly corrupt, and they didn't really update their priors in that way. There's also a literature kind of looking at the causes of democratic backsliding and the rise of populism. And the importance of economic performance is, countries which are doing well seem to consolidate their democratic support. However, less is known about countries which are not doing well. So, and oftentimes countries which are poor, have poor economic performance often have a fair amount of corruption, and it's really hard to separate those two things together. Another stream of research looks at the role of information technology, like 3G provision, in undermining support from incumbents. And they find that as 3G or smartphones have spread around the world, actually incumbent support has fallen, except in the squeakiest of squeaky clean countries. So Denmark and Switzerland. So the United States is not in that category. So in places which have really, really clean government, the spread of smartphones has actually improved incumbent support. But everywhere else, it has been undermined. And it is really potentially the case that this is kind of associated with kind of increased perceptions about corruption. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about nation building and leaders, which I've explored in other work, but I'm also going to tie this to the work that I've been doing on financial solutions to these to these challenges of development in ethnically divided societies as well. But the setting that we're going to use as an example of this is Mexico, and I think Mexico in itself is a fascinating country for many, many reasons. I think one particular thing that's important for us to kind of think about today is that, the Mexican 2022 elections, which were really an election about corruption. So around the world, corruption is being used both in autocratic and democratic societies as a means to distinguish between, the kind of platforms of political parties. In Mexico is very much so. So, if you look at this question, is corruption widespread in the government? In Mexico, the share that responded that it went up fairly dramatically during the reign of the previous president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, from around 65% to around 84%. The president at the time of our study, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, actually campaigned on a anti-corruption, nationalist, and populist platform, calling for national regeneration. That's the name. That's the name of his movement, Morena. He also was very skeptical of government institutions, famously saying, "To the devil with your institutions," among other things, including the Electoral Commission. So what we did in this study is to understand we wanted to understand whether, in fact, apex corruption was having these effects on reducing democratic support for democratic values, as well as what we can do about it, building on the nation building and diversity literature. So we did is we ran a randomized control trial where we randomly gave people two types of videos. One of news footage of unfortunately, AMLO's brother, Pio, taking stacks of cash. So here's actually the kind of the raw footage of him exchanging large quantities of cash. The second question, the second treatment would had leading opposition leaders also doing the same or similar types of activity. Now, to distinguish apex corruption, which was in both of these types of videos, from pure economic policy performance, we also provided a video of basically describing Mexico's performance in the last few years and how it's the way it addressed COVID and its unfortunate underperformance relative to other Latin American countries. All of these videos are available on my website, particularly if you click on the paper. There are links within the paper, and we can make them available after this talk. Now, to counteract this, if we hypothesize that it was in fact the case that apex corruption was going to reduce, so these arrows show our pre-specified hypothesis that apex corruption, particularly by the incumbent, would reduce support for democratic values across all the range of things that I mentioned. The economic policy underperformance might also do that, but through a different channel. But then we tried to offset this, and we tried to do it in two ways. One is we created a nation-building video. We commissioned from a kind of a leading studio in Mexico, which again, I'll provide that link after this course, basically reminding Mexicans of the fortitude and in the face of adversity, the sacrifices they'd made for democracy, and their common identity, things that they hold, which they should be justly proud of, like the music, the food, and some would argue also the football team, El Tri. Our hope was that this might remind people that that they're in it together, particularly in the ethnically diverse setting that I'm going to describe where we did the randomized control trial. A second approach, which I'm going to elaborate on in a moment, is using common financial exposures, giving people a stake and a way to invest and learn by trading stock in the Mexican National Index Fund. And we did that over a period of a few weeks as well. We further pre-specified that apex corruption would have the greatest negative effects for the incumbent because, unfortunately, it was in some ways it was news. So, because the movement had been done on an anti-corruption platform, it was unfortunately even more potent in some sense because that some people in that movement weren't entirely on board with that mission. Now, how do we measure the outcomes? Well, we had, we were fortunate enough to have actually administrative data on actual voting turnout in the elections, which is at the individual level. So we're able to see how treated individuals actually voted, whether they turned out to vote subsequently in the gubernatorial elections. We also engaged in a number of basically, we asked people whether they were willing to volunteer either time or money to support the electoral agency, INE, which is the independent electoral agency in Mexico. And we engaged in a number of lab in the field types of games, including an incentivized trust game where they sent some money to either a politician or a neighbor, and and this money would be returned. Could be returned or could not be. So it's a question of whether the other person, you trust the person enough to give them the money or to take a smaller amount. To test internalized norms, we did what's called the resource allocation game, where people flipped a coin 30 times of different values of denomination, and they put however many heads into a wallet, a sealed envelope, which would be to be given to the municipal mayor either for a public project or to a random neighbor in their community. So this is a way of understanding internalized norms of honesty and stealing. And I just want to preview that actually we were really, I mean, it was fairly remarkable, and we're very actually one happy lesson of this study was actually people had very high internalized norms of honesty. Basically, almost the number of people who returned close to the mean was around almost 15 coins, which is what you would expect from random chance that people returned for both these projects, more for the neighbors than for the public projects, but it's very close. But there were some effects, as I will describe, due to these treatments. We also looked at survey questions to see whether people were conscious of these changes in values, and we compare it with a cross-country interrupted survey design to test whether these effects generalize elsewhere as well. Now, as I mentioned, like in the last class, one important, the context we study is Oaxaca, Mexico, which wasn't chosen by accident. This is, Oaxaca is one of the most culturally and institutionally diverse places in Mexico. It includes 570 municipios of Mexico's 2,476. And part of the reason for that cultural diversity, as I'm going to describe, comes from its historical patterns of exposure to trade, and how this kind of changed the ethnic composition of that state. And I'll provide some details on that in a moment. In particular, a key reason was that Oaxaca. I should show you how many hills there are here, but it's a very rugged place, and it has a lot of different microclimates, some of which were suitable to the production of cochineal or grana cochinilla. Now, some of you might know what cochineal is, but for those of you who aren't in the entomologists, let me describe what it is. So, cochineal was one of the most important sources of natural red dye in the world until the development of synthetics in the 19th century. Popes and kings and cardinals used to love wearing their bright reds, and that comes oftentimes in history. The ones that you see in these pictures often were dyed with cochineal. It was, in fact, the most valued processed good produced in New Spain in the former the colonies of Mexico in Mexico. Of Spain. Now, what is it? Well, it turns out that the British and French thought it was literally a seed, and they tried to take the cochineal and plant it elsewhere. And if you look at the second picture, it does look like a bit of a seed, but actually, it's a domesticated insect. So there's wild cochineal, which flies around and basically is a pest. But the indigenous communities of Latin America were able to domesticate and breed a version where the female basically, she's kind of lazy, I'll have to say. She cannot survive on her own. She has to be dropped onto a cactus where she eats the cactus and basically lives her whole life there. The men are not relevant for this story, mostly. Then when she's ready, they basically dry her, and then they crush the body, and you end up with this bright, brilliant carminic acid, which can be used for dye. Now, this was a major source of tribute, even as during the pre-colonial period. So in the Codex Mendoza, which was included the table of tributes that Montezuma gave to Cortés to bribe him to stay out of Mexico, cochineal features fairly prominently. And one thing that's important to notice is that it's often very fragile. It was, these are the enemies of cochineal, which include many, chickens and turkeys, but also various insects. A small frost could destroy this. You needed a lot of attention and care to do it. Women were highly involved in the production, maybe partly for that reason. It didn't require a lot of strength. And in fact, the Spanish, though they tried to create plantations of cochineal, they failed. And so the cochineal remained in the hands of the indigenous communities, and the Spanish would trade with these indigenous communities. So instead of creating haciendas, they maintained their indigenous basically ways of life, largely because they were connected with cochineal production. Now, just to kind of remind you, in our past class, we talked about a different setting where we looked at Hindus and Muslims in South Asia and how we tried to understand why they were able to live in a tolerant way in these medieval ports for over 1,000 years. And, I made the case that really firstly, there was complementarity. There were the Muslims in South Asia in those ports provided could go to Mecca, and only Muslims could go to Mecca. And these pilgrimage routes were Muslim specific and created this huge Muslim advantage in overseas trade and shipping in the Indian Ocean, all the way up to China, which Hindus, even large sets of Hindus, could not replicate or expropriate. So there were strong incentives to trade with them. Because of the overseas trade network, it was also intangible and thus impossible to steal. There's also a way to share the gains from trade because of immigration and an incentive to develop reinforcing organizations and institutions of trust in these port towns. But what was critical here is that these vulnerable trading minorities also had the ability to leave. So if someone, if you're providing the only provider of a right-hand shoe when everyone else provides a left-hand shoe, you basically, you can benefit much from trade and people want you to have you around. However, if you can't leave and you're stuck there, people can maybe coerce you to basically produce that right-hand shoe. But these minority communities were very, very mobile. And so different port towns basically competed to have them settle around them. And this is one reason why you get this strong incentive for inter-ethnic peace in the ports of South Asia. But what happens when the minorities, the vulnerable groups, are not mobile? So I think an important kind of example of this are the indigenous communities in Mexico, where their endowments, they're not, a lot of their networks are local, and the Spanish are coming from outside and basically are militarily more powerful for much of the colonial period. And as many of you know, the situation was fairly grim for these relatively less mobile, vulnerable groups in Latin America. In fact, the population fell from around 50 to 30 million in 1519 to 2 million in 1600, due to war, famine, disease like the Cocolizli, but among other things. What we were able to do is to reconstruct the populations of pre-colonial Mexico using sources from that period in order to understand the extent and the geographic locations of the groups that survived. And we wanted to answer this question: if you're a vulnerable minority, ethnic group which is less mobile, who is able to survive these very grim situations, and why? And so this is a paper we published a few years ago, where it really transforms, the way that people, I think, at least to me, it transforms the way I think about Mexican politics and history as well. The green circles show you where the populations actually increased in the colonial period. The red is where they decreased or in fact were wiped out. And many of us think about Mexican history as being a history of of peoples living in the hills and about competition about land. And there's a vision that Mexico was not an open, it wasn't very terribly open for trade before the arrival of the Spanish. But if you look at these look at where the cities disappeared, many of them were coastal cities that were basically wiped out in many ways. So what we do is we contrast places which which produced cochineal in the Columbian period, pre-Columbian period, to those which was, as I mentioned, fragile, hard to replicate, and the communities could withhold production, which gave them a kind of a way of getting the Spanish to leave them alone, rather than, it's hard to coerce it. We compare that to the production of quetzal feathers, which was also highly prized by the Aztecs, but not by the Spanish, and thus loses value with international trade. Cacao, which is also from Mexico, but was easily transplantable and replicable, so places which produce that. And gold, where people could coerce labor. And what we find is that if you look at the survival of the communities, basically, consistent with the theory I presented last time and partly just now, the cochineal producing places are more likely to survive over time relative to the quetzal guys. The cacao guys do the worst, and gold, they survive, but let's put it this way: the quality of the way people had to live in those gold mines was not a great one, right? So, in fact, if you look at kind of the long-term consequences, places which produce cochineal actually provide a kind of a window, an avenue of lack of increased women's participation and educational attainment, as well as less poverty more generally, even to today. So so this is kind of, part of part of the theme to understand how complementarities can affect these things. It's also kind of a backdrop to the RCT that I'm now going to present the results of, where we basically sampled and stratified over these groups these communities, both in Oaxaca City and in the country, in the rest of the state, to understand how indigenous identities interact with corruption and whether nation building and other approaches can kind of have differential impacts. Now, I'm going to preview these results because we're still studying those interactions, but I'll give you the overall average effects just now. So what we did here is we sampled 68 urban and rural municipalities in Oaxaca, including Oaxaca City, which is the main metropolis there. Within Oaxaca City, we also randomized whether people got the treatments, these videos, a week or a month before the election. So um, and and yes, and then we basically tried to understand how this affected voter turnout, how these different videos, as well as the financial exposure I mentioned. So what we found is that apex corruption of either kind, either implicating the incumbent party or the opposition, undermined voter turnout by around 46 percentage points, or 6 to 10, 11% on average, and a striking 15.6 percentage points if the treatment was a week before the election. So these are large effects. In contrast, the economic performance video actually raised turnout by 8 to 10 percentage points. People actually became more willing to turn out to vote when they understood that Mexico was not doing as well in relative terms to other Latin American countries, and its management of various policies could have been arguably better. The nation building treatment, despite our best efforts, actually had no effect on turnout whatsoever. You can see the effects are pretty precise zero on voter turnout. However, as I'm going to show you, there's suggestive elements that the treatment aligned voters and behaviors towards the platform and of the nationalist and populist incumbent, who was himself skeptical of electoral institutions and actually was campaigning to undermine the independence of the electoral authority. These effects, if you break it down between incumbent and opposition, these effects, as we expected, even stronger for the incumbent treatment, and particularly so, a striking 22.4 percentage point fall in individual voter turnout if the treatment was received a week before the elections versus a month. Whereas the opposition effect was more uniform over the course of that month. We think this is because there was extensive campaigning during this intervening period as well, which had some offsetting effects if you got the treatment earlier and the incumbent treatment. Now, because we have actual voter turnout, this is pretty precious because we can actually see what people did, but we can also study what they said they did. And if you look at the retrospective vote, 77% said that they turned out to vote, when actually 57.5% did, which kind of suggests that there is a social desirability element when people ask you in a survey, did you turn out to vote? However, the relative patterns are fairly consistent. That the treatment kind of among those that said that they went out, that they went to vote, 22 point, the treatment effect of incumbent corruption was very similar in to that of the actual turnout effect. If you kind of then break it down for whether who they claimed that they voted for, the people who were featured, the party who was featured in the in the video were the ones that were kind of the ones that lost out, relatively speaking. So if you got the incumbent video, you're less likely to vote for the incumbent. Got the opposition video, less likely to vote for the opposition. But the kind of major beneficiary, if you got the incumbent video, was to not turn out or to render a protest null vote, which now you could say that this is still consistent with accountability rather than a decline in democratic values. Maybe people are just saying, well, I would have voted for this party, but I'm not going to turn out. And that's my way of punishing them rather than voting for the other side. So we want to see whether this in fact reflects democratic values. And to do that, we can test it directly, both by behavioral measures and by other measures too. Sorry, yeah, I realize I need to speed up very rapidly because so I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, the economic underperformance video actually had the opposite effect. So it actually increased turnout and it increased it basically, as you can see, voter turnout went out by, there was a decrease in the incumbent vote if you got incumbent corruption. Sorry, if you got the economic underperformance to reduce the support for the incumbent, but it does not reduce turnout in general. It increases the willingness to vote for other parties. The nation building video actually had, again, no effect on turnout on average, but it did increase the incumbent vote somewhat and did decrease that for the opposition. So there's more of an alignment there. When we look at volunteering and donating to organizations, we again find that these effects are, these behaviors are also affected by these treatments in a negative way. This is also the case for internalized norms in stealing. As I mentioned, that the willingness to trust politicians falls, trust neighbors falls. The willingness to steal, as I mentioned, on average, people are basically returning 14.75 coins out of 30 that they could have, which is, one would expect 15 heads to show up on average. So this is very close to a very honest norm. However, getting incumbent corruption, seeing that at the top of government, people are engaged in corrupt activity, even affects that internalized norm in a negative way. I'll just skip over this. People are also conscious of these changes. So if we ask them, about various questions on whether they thought corruption was important, the main issue in their society, what there's various metrics of support for democracy, trust in institutions, and trust in others. We find that yes, in fact, these treatments did increase perceptions of corruption among those who were treated. And they did undermine people's perceptions that democracy was their support for democracy and their trust in institutions and others. Now, I want to, so this is a grim story. It does kind of show that maybe apex corruption is undermining democratic values. But as I mentioned, our kind of aim was to see whether we could, once we diagnosed these issues, could we solve it? We tried the nation building one. It had mixed effects. But another approach is financial exposures, which I talked about a bit in last class. I'll talk about again now. And then very quickly. So why might finance make a difference in this regard? Well, on the incentive side, it's really about sharing the future in incredible ways, and this can help. We all gain from peace and from kind of when the economy does well, but depending on what we're exposed to. And in the absence of transaction costs, we should all be holding a similar portfolio of risky assets, and so this aligns incentives among those who can overcome the cost of incentive investments. And this is even more possible with increased democratization of finance. So the more we are invested together, the more we benefit together. This can be kind of a way of increasing, so overcoming some of the barriers and distinctions we have between us. On the depolarization side, it can also be a relatively nonpartisan gauge of the common good as reflected in the economy. Wall Street is not Main Street, as we talked about in the last class, but it's highly correlated with median household income and with real GDP as well. At the same time, there's great policy uncertainty emerging, particularly nowadays. And so figuring out how to manage these types of risks have become increasingly important in society. However, what my colleague Anna Maria Lusardi calls the big three questions measuring financial literacy, which are kind of the basic ways one might manage risk, just knowing and understanding, basic numeracy about savings accounts, about compound interest, about diversification, whether a mutual fund is less risky or more risky than broader stocks. It's remarkable how low financial literacy is, even in rich countries with fairly well-established markets, let alone in many developing countries. And this is particularly the case for women, where there's a gender gap for reasons for that I may not have time to get into, but perhaps we can talk about in Q&A. So then one question then, for ethnic diversity and nation building, but also I think more generally is, how can we empower citizens in both rich and poor countries, equipping them with tools to help mitigate the risks of the modern economy? And by empowering them, can we mitigate some of these political polarization and conflict issues that emerge? And and one thing that I talked about in last class was there are lessons from history that can teach us this. We talked about the samurai and how the provision of public bonds and then the ability to invest in stocks allowed them to basically both basically spread credit around the country, as well as create these cross-ethnic institutions where samurai were locally invested with non-samurai, and at the national level, the daimyo and were kind of invested in the national project, which kind of seemed to have this effect of reducing violence in Japan and undermining the ethnic divisions, the caste divisions in that society as well. More generally, we see these patterns in England, we see these patterns in America, where these political economy problem solvers have been trying to solve the problems of violence using financial means. And so, motivated by this, we did a number of field experiments in Israel, in the Brexit referendum, and in Mexico, as I'm going to mention and get back to in a moment, where we tried, inspired by these historical and theoretical examples, we tried to see whether we could do something similar today. So, for example, in Israel, what we did in 2015 is we randomly assigned more than 1,000 participants, to get $50 to $100 of a specific financial asset. So these are, some got Israeli stock, some got Palestinian stock. There's a control group where we're just tracking their attitudes separately. And they're encouraged to trade small amounts, only 10% of their portfolio on our online platform for a period of 4 to 7 weeks. What we found was, well, let me just kind of put it in context. Israel is kind of a society where around 22% of the population believe that most people can be trusted. So it's kind of some might say it's a lower trust society relative to, say, Sweden and China, but it's around the same levels as Pakistan and South Africa. But we found that given this exposure, where people were invested and had their kind of, people in the markets and had their interests taken care of by anonymous others, actually increased their generalized trust by around 6 percentage points on average, and particularly so for those who are partisan on the kind of the extremes of the political spectrum, who are, which is particularly, I think, important given the polarization that we're living in some environments today. It also was an empowering intervention, increased their financial literacy, particularly, and their confidence, particularly for women, and reduced the gender confidence gap in financial participation in the setting too. It also increased support for restarting the peace process and changed votes in favor of parties which supported restarting the peace process. And the main effect seems to be because people began to see the gains to Israel's economy from peace relative to a potential expansion of conflict. We also did a similar study in populism, where, as one of the key differences is key parts of populist narratives is about identity. It's about the pure people and a corrupt elite, often, or those others who are often seen as culturally different from this pure group. However, in an influential review article, Sergei Guriev and Elianis Papagiannou argued that there's actually virtually no empirical research on how specific policy solutions. So what we did was we studied whether these effects could work even in the during the Brexit referendum in Britain. Now, I don't need to remind you of the Brexit referendum. The one thing that struck me was I'm British as well as American, and I like to think Indian. One thing that struck me was that the day after the referendum, the number two question trending in Britain on Google was, what is the European Union? So I felt like my fellow British citizens maybe had not thought this through quite as much as they should have on this momentous decision. In fact, as we've seen over time, there's been a decline in relative to what it could have been of the UK economy in a variety of different metrics. And nowadays, many people believe that maybe a majority believe that maybe the decision was not the best one, and the biggest kind of loser was the UK economy. So what we did was we did a similar study during that referendum where we exposed likely to UK citizens to trade three firms that complemented the UK economy, three UK firms that complemented the EU, and also US firms in the same category as well. What we found is that this exposure, increased support for Remain in the referendum, particularly those who got UK-EU complementary assets, and particularly those among swing voters and those who are more open to a European identity, more expansive identity than sort of more of a nationalistic one ex ante. So this is just showing you that the effects are mainly on the swing voters. This is showing you that the treatments are, the EU and UK assets are having more of an effect mostly among those swing voters. And this is what it looks like in a regression framework. This is also showing you finally that the effects are higher for those with a ex ante, more open your identity. So identity really matters, even not just in Mexico but also in Britain, though the kind of fissures are quite different. It was also an empowering intervention, so people became more financially literate, which I think is a key part of how we should think about these types of interventions. Does it help people as well as well? So what's the mechanism? Well, we asked them, what does the European Union mean to you? And the effect really, of the treatment was really to counter some of the populist narratives, which said that the EU was a waste of money, it was a threat to the British cultural identity, and that it would lead to, that leaving the EU would lead to more economic prosperity. We found that those in the treatment group began to equate the EU with economic prosperity and did not see it as a threat to their cultural identity quite so much as before. And if you kind of try to understand what explains their vote in the referendum, these things seem to attenuate the coefficient the most. So participants did not become more European, but the effects seem to come from those that began to associate the European Union with economic prosperity and not a threat to their cultural identity, and it increased their financial literacy. We also did a style-up study in the US, which I won't get into, but please look it up. It's on our webpage. But returning to Mexico, what we did, to counteract these issues of apex corruption was randomize whether people got exposure to the Mexican stock market using basically a text message platform on their phones. So unlike these other studies where we had access to strong internet backbones, this was done door to door and using text message. However, even despite the kind of the technology being more rudimentary, we still find some suggestive effects that getting the stock treatment, increase people's support for democracy, increase support in people's trust, consistent with the Israel study, and though it didn't really affect turnout quite so much. It didn't affect corruption because it should be orthogonal to corruption as well. Quickly moving on. So we during the course of our experiment, another brother of the president was also found exchanging stacks of cash. So we could see whether the effects of apex corruption actually accumulate with two treatments rather than with one. And we find that our effects persist 3 months after the study, even the original one. Second, if you get two guys as well as one, the effects seem to even accumulate somewhat more. So it seems like repeated doses of seeing people at the top engaging in corruption is having increasing effects on the reducing support for democracy. We kind of look at this more broadly using interrupted survey design, seeing people who were surveyed in Latino Barometer just before and just after an apex corruption scandal. And we find very consistent effects. Corruption perceptions go up, support for democracy falls, as does trust in institutions, and support for authoritarianism also increases. Does being more apex matter more? Well, we don't have much variation because we're looking at the scandal level, but you can see that if the corruption involved the president, the kind of distribution tends to be higher in the corruption perceptions and in the decrease in democracy on average than for those who are kind of less apex, but not quite as apex as the top of the government. This also has effects on protests, particularly violent protests. So unlike nonviolent protests, and it's different from other types of things which might also lead to kind of these effects, like as winning a football game or something like that. So as we kind of described, satisfaction of democracy has plummeted even as perceptions of widespread corruption has risen. We ask, could apex corruption be eroding democratic values? If so, what can we begin to do about it? Well, we find, yes, apex corruption is eroding democratic values, and it seems to be different than honest incompetence. Like, in fact, economic underperformance bolsters people's willingness to turn out to vote. What can you do about it? We found the nation-building study treatment didn't have quite the effects that we were hoping for in terms of boosting support for democracy, though it did align people with the nationalist platform of the president. I think the finance study does, I think it was particularly promising in offsetting these things. I think more work has to be done. We need more of a backbone, but we can implement this in developing countries as well. I think also one thing that kind of strikes me, and is when I teach corruption at Stanford to our MBA students, not a how-to, but kind of a how to manage kind of situation. Oftentimes, people do raise this problem of strategic complementarities. That, how do you not engage how do you stay honest when other people are engaging in corrupt activities and manage to survive as a business? Well, I think one thing that comes out of the study is that even though there's room for the implication that the apex corruption can have these effects also means there's room for apex honesty. If you see honest people at the very top of government, this can change the entire people's broader perceptions and willingness to be honest in society as well, both within firms, but also at the level of the state. And you can see even AMLO, AMLO himself, the perceptions of corruption, the widespread nature of corruption in Mexico have fallen with AMLO, notwithstanding the kind of shenanigans that maybe a brother or two have been involved in. So, however, what we found is that honest apex corruption politicians can also disappoint, and this can be particularly dangerous. So if you lose, if the person that you put your hopes in, if the people around them are not quite as honest, this can have particularly problematic results as well. But I think that there's broader lessons to be had here, which we're beginning to explore about how this interacts with ethnic diversity as well. So in Oaxaca, the nation building video did have different effects on people from the indigenous versus the non-indigenous groups, those that had been exposed to cochineal historically versus other indigenous communities. And that maybe I will share with you in the future once we've understood the data better. But this is what I wanted to talk about today. It was like talking about one particular avenue for strengthening governments, understanding the effects of apex corruption, how to address it. It's important to understand how we got there, how there is ethnic, that there are these indigenous communities which have different histories of market activity, different histories of trust in society and more broadly. And then two treatments that we were interested in the implications of. One is the nation building literature kind of type treatment, bringing on fortitude. The other one is leveraging financial innovations. And with that, I'm going to stop. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. Oh, Please keep in touch. Right. So I'm looking at the chat right now. There's no open questions. Summer, is there anything that came up that you think we should talk about?
We had one question that asked about um whether or not, I mean, we don't consider it in this experiment, but thoughts on legal or quasi-legal corruption. So where an act can be seen by the public as harmful and corrupt, but it doesn't violate the law. Um, and extensions in lobbying, state and regulatory capture, and honest graft. So leaders using insider information for profit. Um, so where it's not explicitly taking money on camera, as in the experiment, but something else that might be perceived in a similar way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because there's a legal definition of corruption. The in the United States, there's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I think is in abeyance at the moment, which actually allows for things like speed payments and basically if you giving a consideration to someone to speed what they should already be doing. Whereas the UK anti-bribery statute and that of the European Union and other places actually bans even that activity. I think the I think the key thing is that these things can also undermine, even though they might be legal, they might, well, let me put it this way. If they're legal, it means that they can be regulated, which is has some benefits, as you know. And so there's, for example, money in politics, the fact that there is possible to track, well, it used to be possible to track where donations were coming from in some countries, particularly the US. But it has some benefits relative to places where it's illegal and therefore more opaque. However, I think even when something's illegal, then laws are the product of the political process. And so when you have people who are doing things which might be legal, but look like they could very easily lead to perceptions of a quid pro quo. If that's happening at the top of the government, this can also, I think our research suggests that this can also have these types of deleterious effects. In fact, the stacks of cash, even though the stacks of cash videos were, the footage was there, the Attorney General of Mexico, which was part of the incumbent government, dismissed this case as being okay and not ultimately. So that would fall into this category as well. But though someone might ask, why aren't you using, you know, a more conventional channel, which has, where there's oversight, such as an electronic transfer, instead of, oodles of pesos on a table in a cafe.
Yeah. And then
Um,
I think we have another question about
mhm.
how financial literacy has impacts on the study.
Yeah, so I think that financial literacy is a crucial objective in and of itself, and so by having people understand, the people often understand that you should diversify. I mean, that kind of idea conceptually is actually many people understand it, but how to implement that in the financial markets by buying a mutual fund or an index fund versus individual stocks is not something that if you look at the tests that people have done around the world, including by my colleague Anna-Maria Lusardi, many people don't make that leap. And so being able to operationalize how to manage geopolitical risk in the financial markets and even by understanding investment, this is really important for people. It also has these effects of, you know, it can also have these knock-on social dividends, as we described, particularly in ethnically diverse societies, where people can begin to not only credibly see that they're investing in a broader project, which is the national economy, but they can benefit from from when that economy does well. So I think that kind of the broader increase in people's ability to participate is actually crucial for overcoming some of the problems of ethnic divisions and divisiveness and help leverage instead the gains from ethnic diversity.
Yeah. Um, our next question is someone who's thinking about the effects of apex honesty, and they want to know if we know anything about how likely positive versus negative images of leaders are to spread. So if there's been any research on to the potential effects of apex honesty or spillover there.
Um, so I'm writing a book about the about how nonviolent protests work, and part of that is understanding how heroism and leadership can emerge, and one key aspect of that, which you kind of see in a number of nonviolent movements, is that of sacrifice. So, Gandhi famously used to always travel third class and was very austere, and even though it was incredibly expensive to keep him in those third class railway carriages, and because of the logistics of it, armed the trappings of, many of the trappings of the presidency in Mexico, like the corporate, the jet and various things. And I think people respond very favorably to kind of personal willingness to kind of give up these types of things. I think, so there are examples at least where, these types of activities where you're not where you're showing that you're, walking the walk as well as talking the talk, can have very potent effects on honesty. I think this is an open research area that we are working on, but it's a great question. And it also gives me a lot of hope, to be honest.
Yeah. On sort of extending that question, we have a question that asks how long you think honest apex leadership can stay honest in a corrupt system.
I think this is also this is a fantastic question because it kind of goes to who has agency. So people at the very top actually can change the system, is what is the argument that we're making. That they can make it for both good or ill. If they're acting or perceived to act in a corrupt manner, this can trickle through even into our internalized norms of honesty in society because of those three reasons we mentioned, that these are focal people, there's common knowledge that these guys are at the top and are engaging in these activities. So this can change the way that societies coordinate. Similarly, and again, we need to do the research on it, but I think that honest leaders at the very top can change the culture. And so this actually does, I don't think we need to be fatalistic that the corrupt system stays corrupt. I think that what our research shows is that, this can change, and this can change with leadership. And so it behooves us to choose those leaders and hold them accountable, but also, it also, mostly we need to choose the right people, I would say.
Yeah, sort of on the other more depressing side of that, we had an interesting question that I know we go into a little bit on the paper that asks if apex corruption leads to an erosion of democratic values, if we see a rise in preferences for more autocratic forms of government as an alternative. And I know that we measure this, I think, in more ways than we got into in the presentation.
Yeah. So in short, yes, there does seem to be an increase in support for authoritarian alternatives, but I think when you get these types of at least in the cross country data that we looked at, but and just, but I think the way one might think about it is not that, oh yeah, we're going to go you know full on dictatorship is what people have in mind. I think what they have in mind is what we need is someone who doesn't have these shackles of checks and balances. That that it's kind of, if you lose faith in the system, then maybe what you need is sort of an apex honest person to kind of clean the system. And so, you can think about so apex honesty can actually be a very potent message for would-be authoritarians as well. And so, there's kind of a trade-off there. They could actually reduce corruption. It obviously doesn't always happen. In fact, dictatorships are often very corrupt, as you know. But there is this window, this platform, this idea that I think people can find quite attractive. That if you have this your philosopher king or person who's with strong moral values, they can change the system. When you see people in the existing system not acting the way that one might hope.
Yeah, I think someone sort of wants to extend that and ask, um, how an ape or if an apex honest person might need to act almost unilaterally if the government is viewed as largely corrupt and resistant to change. And I think maybe there's uh, another question there about how, and we got this as the chat came up, about how apex corruption might trickle down throughout leadership, not just among constituents.
Yeah, so I think that that again kind of goes back to the idea of agency, right? So I think some of these questions kind of point to the fact that maybe people, you're trying hard to change the system, but it's a hard system to change, and that's undoubtedly the case. I guess, but the people at the very top can change the system, right? So, and they can change, and what we're making, what we're showing is they can change the culture as well. They can even change the way people perceive that they themselves should be acting, and I think that gives me a lot of hope, to be honest. I mean, it seemed like an insoluble problem, and I think it's easy to get kind of fatalistic about, oh, things are always going to be this way. But a lot of countries have seen changes in their system. That, countries which used to have strong, high degrees of political corruption, high degrees of ethnic cronyism, have been able to kind of overcome that, and there have been, I think leadership is maybe one component that we haven't studied quite so much in this regard. So I think we have time for one more question, or if there are no more questions, um, oh,
Okay, I think we have our last question, which is, um, in many low-income countries, corruption is becoming a norm. Are you still optimistic?
um, so I think our research speaks to the possibility of change. It doesn't mean that it will happen, but I think demonstrating that so that possibility exists actually does give me hope, if not optimism. I would say that it takes people like the folks like you who are trying to solve these problems to make a difference. But I think knowing that it can change, and this is something that was a revelation to me. I when I was teaching corruption to our MBA students, again, not a how-to, but how to manage. I would often say, well, maybe we're kind of on this kind of this cusp, this inflection point where enough people get on board, we'll have bandwagon effects, and we can change the societal norms. But the chances of being that in that category and that moment are very small. And so I had to always acknowledge that. But now I think our research says, well, no, actually, I mean, if you are kind of, as you get higher up in these hierarchies, and maybe you can make a change, and you can actually change things systemically. This actually means that things can change much faster and much much less contingent in that sense. Now, of course, the people who move up the hierarchies are often the people who don't want the reforms, but that doesn't mean that we can't choose those guys. And this is one of the things where I think democracy can help. That as long as we have these turnovers, we can select for these folks. Maybe we can change things in a very positive way, and it could happen much faster than I think many of us thought before. Right. Well, I've still got my contact information up there. Please do keep in touch. It's been such a pleasant pleasure to talk to you all, and you know where to find us. So have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you so much.